In our society, the most common traumas in women and children occur at the hands of their parents or intimate partners. Child abuse, molestation, and domestic violence all are inflicted by people who are supposed to love you. That knocks out the most important protection against being traumatized, being sheltered by the people you love. If the people whom you naturally turn to for care and protection terrify or reject you, you learn to shut down and to ignore what you feel. As we saw in Part 3, when your caregivers turn on you, you have to find alternative ways to deal with feeling scared, angry, or frustrated. Managing your terror all by yourself gives rise to another set of problems: dissociation, despair, addictions, a chronic sense of panic, and relationships that are marked by alienation, disconnection, and explosions. Patients with these histories rarely make the connection between what happened to them long ago and how they currently feel and behave. Everything just seems unmanageable. Relief does not come until they are able to acknowledge what has happened and recognize the invisible demons they're struggling with. Recall, for example, the men I described in Chapter 11 who had been abused by pedophile priests. They visited the gym regularly, took anabolic steroids, and were strong as oxen. However, in our interviews, they often acted like scared kids. The hurt boys deep inside still felt helpless.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our Part 10 study of the book, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body, and the Healing of Trauma by Bessel van de Kolk, MD. And getting started, I guess one of the biggest takeaways that I wrote down is limbic system repair and how that's very necessary in dealing with trauma. And they went over a lot of different techniques that could be used to so-called heal the limbic system. And it showed that there's one case where one study where 10 weeks of yoga proved to be more beneficial to helping patients with trauma-related illnesses or trauma in general versus medication and other therapies. So I think yoga and meditation should definitely be practiced more amongst non-white, particularly Black people, because it just shows that this book shows how constructive it is. And I think if non-white people, especially Black people, practice more in their breathing, then they may be able to produce more clear thoughts and able to discover their purpose, which is to produce a system of justice where no one is mistreated and those who need help receive help. I'll table the rest of my thoughts for now and see if you'd like to share anything, Miss Ash.
Yeah, sure. So my overall thoughts, I agree. I think he basically starts off this section talking about how the brain or the body has the capacity to kind of like, I mean, he used the words control. I don't really like that term, but at least like influence the brain, which I thought was really interesting. And then so he goes through like different techniques of healing, and especially like I guess what people would call like so-called alternative medicines, which are only alternative to like Europeans or white people. But I thought that it was really interesting that he went through kind of different practices and how beneficial or unbeneficial they were. So I'm excited to go through them, and I have a lot of notes. So yeah, I don't know if you want to go first with your notes, or we can go back and forth. It's up to you.
We could go back and forth. I thought it was really significant him talking about how when attempting to heal or better one's mind and body and brain, one of the essential tools for that is learning how to breathe. You know, it's necessary for any recovery. And I suspect due to the trauma that racism and white supremacy produces among non-white people, especially Black people, that we lack the ability to even breathe correctly, which is why we have a very hard time finding mindfulness and practicing mindfulness. And I really like his kind of definition of mindfulness. It's like basically having a lens able to oh, 1 second. You can take over.
Okay. Let's see. Well, you were talking about his definition of mindfulness. Were you saying like, I actually don't remember the specific definition, so it would be helpful if you could reiterate it.
Oh yeah, so the definition was having a lens of being able to problem solving and living, problem solving, and healing. So it's basically living a life with that lens of being able to do those three things, something along those lines. And I thought wow, that problem solving one, that aspect is really important. And if Black people could practice that more, it would be really constructive and damaging the system of white supremacy. You have any notes, comments you'd like to share?
Yeah. The first thing I thought was interesting was, like I was saying earlier, about how he said that the body can control the brain, and he was talking about people who have a lot of trauma are more likely to be like compulsive eaters or compulsive drinkers, which I would consider myself to be a compulsive eater. And I thought that was really interesting because I don't think a lot of people like when you was referring to the breathing, like how that can really affect your mindset and the way that you're able to like process a situation. And I know that there's different like breathing techniques that can be used. Like I personally, I don't know why, I've just never used them. And so I like listening to this made it more interesting to me and more like something that I want to do. But I thought it was really interesting when he was talking about like PTSD and kind of like non-Western cures, basically what non-white people have been doing. And he went through like a list of like drumming, like rhythm, martial arts, etc. And it just reminded me of how like so much of, I don't know, like our abilities to function are just really tainted by white people. Like for example, like giving birth, there's like the 3 R's, which is like rhythm, repetition, and ritual. And it's similar to what he was talking about, like when you give birth, like you're supposed to kind of find a ritual where you repeat certain breathing rhythms and certain moving rhythms so that you're able to kind of transfer the pain. Basically like what he was saying, using your body to kind of control your mind and the way that your senses are responding to the pain that you're feeling. I just thought it was so interesting because it's like for decades, no, not even decades, for like centuries now, these white doctors have really ruined the process of giving birth and have turned it into this really like surgical and horrible experience for a lot of women. And now, they're like, oh, well, maybe we should try these non-Western practices, after subjecting women to a lot of like these horrible, painful births. I just think it's really interesting how, I think at one point he said too, like, these are practices not used in the mainstream, which I thought was interesting wording because like, I think that was a very like, I guess, Eurocentric wording because what is the mainstream? Like he means like white society, like these are the type of tools that are not used by white society. And I think that even when white people are gonna try to use them, let's say you're like in a therapy session and they're giving you different breathing techniques and etc. If they're not really talking about like this, like if they're not really talking about white supremacy or how these systems are affecting your day-to-day, how they're affecting the way that you're processing everything, all of this is really just helping you cope. And in a way, it's kind of helping white supremacy. Like, not to say that we're all supposed to like be suffering, but to say that like you have to be really careful about using these techniques, because are you just using them so that you can function day to day under the system, or are you using them so that you can like build the sort of fortitude that you can like end these systems? Because if not, then you're almost just helping white supremacy function better. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, I agree. These techniques could be used to just make white supremacy more comfortable instead of using the tools to attempt to produce justice. So I am very well said. I think it was really you're right. It's really interesting how he mentioned all the non-white practices of the things that they do to make themselves stronger, like taekwondo, jujitsu, capoeira, and a lot of other tai chi, various other non-white practices that are used to improve the mind, and they all have always had 3 things in common. They involve breathing, physical movement, and meditation. So these are the 3 things that the non-white people who are serious about their mental wellness and being strong, they focus on their breathing, their physical movement, and meditation. So this is something that especially Black people and all non-white people who are not doing so should attempt to also begin to focus on, because this is what can make a individual person stronger, I suspect. And it'll get closer to that path of being mindful, living the ability to not move by fear anymore, the fear of system of racism, white supremacy, be able to understand that your thought, speech, and action has been molded by the system and begin to replace that thought, speech, and behavior with counter racist logic, counter racism.
Yeah, something that I thought was like really interesting and almost kind of comical is that he's like laying out all of these tools that are really effective to healing trauma, or at least being able to process your trauma. And it's like they're obviously all from non-white countries. And I don't think, and he never makes the next step or the next correlation of like, maybe like we should upend or like not even do any of the practices that we're doing in like America or with these white doctors, or even like he doesn't make the next step to be like, you know, maybe it's the act of just living in America, you know, a place that, or like in these white countries, especially a place that gives you like no tools to really process everything that goes on here. And just the fact of living here in general is so traumatizing that like, you know what I mean? Like he never takes it to that next step. He's just like, oh, and isn't it interesting how all of these other areas like, or like countries, they have these tools for you to process them. Or it's never like setting up a residency so that like white doctors are going to these places and learning how to learning these proper practices. It's just like, we're just now gonna, like us white doctors are just gonna implement them in our practice. But do they really understand them on a deeper spiritual level?
Dang. Well said. I don't know if the Yoruba would allow them to. There's too many splits have possibly been made there. I thought it was really interesting because we had been learning throughout this text that dissociative states and dissociation is a symptom of trauma. And I've been reading this other book called Program to Kill, and it talks about how dissociative states is needed to make one susceptible to mind control. And it mentions how hypnotism has also been used in conjunction with trauma and dissociative states to help to create so-called alternate personalities. But just to be blunt, it's just a way to mind control a person. So it's a system of white supremacy, I believe is some sort of people like to call it brainwashing, but I think a more correct term is brain trashing. Is a brain trashing system which definitely controls our thought, speech, and action by making it very limited, and also making the majority of it being encoded with messages that mean attack black or dark is bad and whatnot. So it's really interesting to hear hypnotism mentioned in this book. And the author says whether hypnotism will be used in this field or elsewhere. And where else? And I suspect elsewhere is he's possibly referring to CIA various programs where they have spent a lot of money and time and energy attempting to use hypnotism and mind control and dissociative states to control people, and how they also have used drugs. So if this system of white supremacy traumatizes non-white people to the point where everyone is a little bit disassociated, and then they're subjected to music that tells them to do certain things, and a large majority of them do it, that looks like some sort of mind control. You know, Future tells everyone to go, you know, smoke weed and do lean, and then everyone goes, a lot of non-white Black people go and do that, and that definitely seems to be some form of mind control, whether it's consciously or subconsciously. But this is just the power of the system, I believe, but I could be incorrect.
Yeah, I feel like in that moment, he was withholding a lot of information, especially because of like the things that we've been reading now, or I mean, what you've been reading in the documentaries we've been watching, like, hypnosis is obviously still happening to some degree. And it has happened significantly in our past. It would have been nice for him to talk about the, I guess, detrimental aspects of it and how it was used, or how it has been like used by the government, CIA and other organizations. But obviously, like, that's not something that he's going to talk about because he's probably limited in what he can say because of who he ultimately like serves. So I thought that was interesting. I'm really interested in actually talking about the aspect of like drugs, and but I don't want to get to it yet because it's like later on. But I think it'll be a really interesting conversation. Something that I thought was really interesting was when he was talking about, I think he's talking about in World War II or World War One, I don't remember, the German Blitz, and he says that the children who actually stayed in bomb shelters with their families fared better than the ones who were separated from their families and in a safe environment. And that made me think immediately of like all these kids who are kidnapped and separated from their families through the CPS system, and how it's probably much more traumatizing that they're being separated from the family than the fact that, I mean, then like whatever new home that they're gonna be in, and I think it's interesting because he seems to be a well-known like psychiatrist, so therefore this information must be known, that kids fare better when they're with their family, even if they're going through trauma with their family, than if they were in a situation where there's not trauma but they're still around people that they've known their whole lives. So I thought that was really, really interesting. Wondering your thoughts on that too, because like we know how the system kind of takes Black children away from their attempted parents.
Yeah, hearing that portion really made me think about the child attempted parent separation that goes on throughout the globe, and it makes me even highly suspicious of foster facilities, juvenile facilities, any facilities involving children. But I see it as definitely refine our supremacy, them being able to kidnap non-white children, and they know that the children are going to be greatly traumatized. And we do have a lot of kidnapped and missing children. And the book also mentions what potentially happens to those children, and it's involves lots of trauma and lots of subjection to violence and sexual violence, and all the reason why the system should be replaced with a system of justice so this can stop happening. But back to the point, I believe that a lot of foster facilities, even foster parents, serve a huge role to maintaining the system of white supremacy, whether it's by producing highly traumatized non-whites, or just they're practicing racism their own way by mistreating those non-white children that come into their possession. And also they could be used for purposes that I have no knowledge in, because I'm still learning about this system, and how far it is willing to go to practice racism against not just non-white adults, but from babies to elders. The system of white supremacy does not discriminate. It is war against all non-white people. All ages apply. So hope that answers your question. I know it's a bit long-winded, but I'm working on that.
No, it wasn't long-winded at all. And I completely agree. Like, I think the foster care system, and if we really lived in a system that was trying to help these children, it would be, the model would be, we need to help the parents, because taking the children away is just going to further traumatize them. Therefore, how can we make sure that the parents are going to be able to be functional parents, So I just thought that was really interesting. And I completely agree with what you were saying.
Yeah, another interesting point that was brought up is like this, the importance of a caregiver who cares. And in the system of white supremacy, our caregivers, the caregivers of non-white people, is racist man, racist woman. And then the text mentions that when a caregiver turns their back on the child or treats the child poorly, that immediately can traumatize the child to a severe degree, where there could be lots of future conflict in that child's life. So this is why amongst non-white people there's so much conflicts, because the people who should be taking care of us, if it's racist man and racist woman, instead of taking care of us, they kill us and mistreat us and rape us and exploit us. So this is why there's every non-white person is a mistreated child who especially those who are more confused about what's happening on planet Earth and don't have the will to produce justice. So I thought it was very interesting how this knowledge is well known. So this is how, and it makes sense how in counter racist logic, it's we've been programmed from birth, like already receiving these messages from the womb, depending on what kind of attempted parent we have or had. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree. When he said that, it reminded me of the code too, like the idea that we are basically like neglected and abused children. I thought that was really interesting. And especially like talking about well, it's okay, keep going, sorry.
No, yeah, you're right. Yeah, and also how when there's a breakdown and attunement between the caregiver and the baby, even that can cause tremendous problems in a baby's life. And this is why we're literally in the system of white supremacy, non-white people are born broken, because unless we've been prepared by the attempted parents into what we're coming into, we come into this war where mistreatment is experienced immediately, and just because we don't have the words to express it doesn't mean our brain computers and can't pick up on the mistreatment and experience that in a negative way, to the point where it produces more problems in our future, where we become hyper arousal individuals are shut down people who really are lacking of feelings and are just so comfortable in their abuse or attempt to negate their abuse with sugar and other drugs and poisons that white people allow us to consume and like for us to consume. So really, really good book to contextualize to the system of white supremacy.
Something that I was interested too is and I don't think I mean I may have missed it, but I was wondering like who even defines trauma? Because I think a big thing about it too is like living in the system is white people are going to always tell you that what you're experiencing is not trauma or that. And so I thought it was interesting, like even in this conversation, like, and I guess I wanted to kind of pose that question is, you know, who even defines like what is trauma, and is there even a threshold that's like, oh, this situation is trauma and this situation is not, or is it just based on like how it affects you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think going up off how it affects one is a good basis, but I just like to look at it from a counter racist logic standpoint. You know, if there's a war being waged against me and I have been made an enemy combatant without my knowledge, that's very traumatizing. So everything that relates to that war impacting me is traumatic, you know, to me. So whether it's a race soldier, me narrowly surviving a encounter with a race soldier, or me scrolling and watching a race soldier brutalize a fellow prisoner of war, a fellow captured non-white Black person. Yeah, that's it's pretty traumatizing to me, and it's traumatizing because releases I don't know, stress hormones. It's and great deal of mistreatment. You know, it shows that when this is repeated over the span of centuries, it could and has retards a entire collective of people to seem to be unable to counter the problem successfully, or even begin to understand a problem on a collective scale.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think especially like something that I was thinking about too is just the fact that a lot of people don't even know that they're being traumatized. Like one thing that they were talking about is how they were comparing Otto and Otto and her husband, I think, on how they processed the accident. And like Otto was not even able to be aware that the accident was a part of a larger story. She just saw it as like fragmented scenes that was causing her body to be stressed. And that when I heard that, that reminded me so much of a lot of people who can't like contextualize that their trauma is, or like what they're going, like it's not just like individual moments, it's like a larger narrative of living under the system of white supremacy. So that's why I kind of asked, because I like I think that a lot of people don't even realize that they are like traumatized.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of people are not aware of their victimization of their trauma, and especially to a good degree where they are able to call it trauma, call it mistreatment, and especially call it resulting from the system of racism, white supremacy. But that is expected. But I thought it also was really interesting of how when comparing adults and so-called adults and children, and to how they heal from certain trauma, one thing that kept popping up was physical touch. It was touching, hugging, and rocking. So rocking a adult and or a baby has soothing effects, counter trauma effects that can be employed. So I'm like, oh, this is really constructive information for folks who are raising babies, and baby maybe traumatized or maybe experience a slight trauma and maybe crying as a resulting from that, and possibly rocking the baby while gently touching it maybe will soothe the baby, and perhaps even the person rocking the baby. So this is really constructive information on how to counter many of the traumas that are mentioned in this text. Yeah, I think now white people could definitely practice, attempt to practice this more in a constructive way.
Yeah, I mean, that too is like what he was talking about. These are practices that kind of date back to long periods of time in non-white countries, because in a lot of countries in West Africa, like it's really common that you hold your baby is attached to you in some way. Like they usually tie the babies on their back when they're just doing things throughout the day. And so the baby is constantly in a state of like rocking back and forth. And so it's like things like that have been, and there's a doctor who made a lot of money in America, basically like with a book detailing all of these practices that are done. And I don't want to say he necessarily like came up, he implied that he came up with it, but to an extent he did, even though like these are practices that are done in a lot of non-white countries. So I do think that like the act of touch and rocking your child is like really, really important. And it also goes to show how far we are from our humanity, because you would think that these are things that we just know to do just because, like we're humans and we exist. But I think we're so detached from each other that you have to remind people to like touch each other. You have to remind people to, like give that sort of affection.
Agreed. Have to be reminded of your so-called humanities in the old ways. This is why I appreciate the code for reminding me that there's no such thing as humans. We're not trained or allowed to be humane to each other. So we're all just subhumans until there's a system of justice. Bunch of subhumans attempting to produce justice and solve the greatest problem in the known universe, which is racism, white supremacy. And yeah, they have a history of doing that, taking our knowledge and selling it back to us, are using it to mend their mental wounds inflicted upon us. hurt your enemy, then nurse your enemy back to health. It's what white people, it's what it looks like when white people are using techniques stolen or gotten from non-white people. Very, very interesting and refined practice of white supremacy. I also like that it was what was mentioned is stress hormones and how to deal with them and what they're used for. And I saw them as being like it's like a chemical that your body is supposed to use to deal with trauma. So it's being inflicted upon your mind or body, because your body is supposed to do something about it. You're not just supposed to withstand, you're supposed to like fight or flee. But because the brain computers are often highly retarded by the system of white supremacy, and I believe white people and non-white people are a greatly retarded people because of the system of white supremacy. So because our brain computers don't function as they should, instead of fight or flight, sometimes it freezes, it like shuts down. And I thought it was really interesting. And a good example of this is when the 5th degree female black belt, she was attacked and she froze during the attack, and it said because her frontal lobe had shut down because of the trauma. Her defense mechanism had shut down, and when the stress hormones were released, she then wasn't able to do the correct things with the stress hormones. So she had to basically relearn and learn how to transform her fear into energy to do something about her problem. So if she's ever attacked again, which she was, but she was able to counter the problem much more successfully than she was prior. That's because she was able to use her brain computer to I don't want to say resilient, but make her more constructive in dealing with fear, which is something non-white people have been totally trained against. We've actually been trained in fear. This is like a fear system that terrorizes us, that makes the large majority of us very complacent and unwilling to even speak about the race problem, which is why there's a term great spectators. So we have really been made of a really fearful people, but it's about time we turn that energy into constructive counter racism energy by coming up with ways, just the best ways, possibly producejustice.com, attempt to get on code, form your own code, change your thoughts, speech, and action, and just start talking about the race problem. It's the biggest problem on planet Earth, yet there's so little people attempting to solve it. Not just talk about it, attempt to solve the race problem. Ask white people why they haven't done so, because this book is a prime example of the madness that white supremacy produces. And a lot of this stuff is even happening to white people. So for the white people who are listening, you don't want to be a white sacrifice, But I've been going on. I'll mute my lines. See if Miss Ash has something to share.
Yeah. Well, what else was I going to say? Oh, I thought that part was interesting too with the black belt, and it reminds me of, I think in a way, like a lot of Black people go through that. It's like, but it's not, maybe not like a physical battle, but like psychologically, like when there's a moment where we can actually, like, I would say what happened last year with George Floyd and how many people were upset about it and protesting about it. That was kind of a moment where I think in a way we kind of, like, do you think that in that moment our stress response was flee, fight, or freeze? O5, or like a combination of many?
As a collective, I think it was a large combination. But as for the people who are like out in the streets, so to say, they were definitely I think they were doing a fight response. Not I wouldn't say that was a flee response for sure.
Yeah, I would say it was more of like a freeze, like, because nothing new, like as someone who went to some of those protests, like nothing new was done, right? It was just like a rehashing of things that people did in the past. And it's almost like people are frozen in 1960 or something and like don't understand any other way. And so I thought that maybe like it was like a freeze response, and it reminded me of that woman where with all of the like I feel like there, maybe not everyone, but there are people who maybe learn a lot about history or read about the past. With even amongst all of that, like the behavior was exactly the same. And I think sometimes like I think he talks about in the book how trauma can like suppress your creativity or an imagination. And I think that's like what has happened kind of like collectively to Black people.
Really excellent and tragic point. I think that it's very accurate. We have been so traumatized that we are in the cycle of protesting and expecting white people to change, not knowing that we are the ones who need to change because white people aren't going to change. Evidence shows that they like practicing racism, white supremacy. At least a large majority of them choose to do so. So it's up to non-white people to change and do things with constructive results and just be more like white people in a sense where they have a code. All right, we need our own code. All right, what's some of their codes? Well, lie to non-white people and mistreat them. That's one of their codes. All right, well, how can we take that code and make it constructive? All right, share constructive information with non-white people and be suspicious of white people always. All right, that's a code. That's a non-white code that can reduce problems and introduce each other to constructive information. But they've been so traumatized that this code idea or even sharing constructive information with each other instead of Bible verses and with each other seems very foreign to the unfortunately average non-white victim of racism, white supremacy. And yeah, it was just a greatly traumatized, retarded group. And I don't say retarded because we were born that way, but retarded because we've been made that way by the total domination and mistreatment of white supremacy, where our thoughts don't make sense.
Yeah, I guess we can move on to like some of the comparisons and analysis of the different treatments that they talked about. One thing that I really appreciated about this section was him talking about the kind of I don't want to say failure, but the ways in which cognitive behavioral therapy can kind of fall short. And I really like that he brought this up, because when I started therapy, that's what I wanted to do. I was like, okay, I'm gonna go to therapy and I'm gonna fix my problems. I want, like, the moment that I was in therapy, I told my therapist, like, I want to do CBT. And I remember her being like, well, why do you want to do it? And I was like, well, because I want to fix the way that I'm acting. I want to be like, well, at the time I didn't know the right words, but I want to be more correct in my behavior. And I think that what was really interesting is that he kind of talked about, CBT kind of, or cognitive behavioral therapy, falls short if you're not able to really understand your trauma. If you're not really able to understand what you're going through, you're going to be trying to solve a problem that you don't even really understand the problem. And it reminds me of kind of like how we kind of were reading ISIS papers and then Yurugu and then the code. I feel like in a way, like ISIS papers and Yurugu were really like us doing a kind of psychoanalysis, like an understanding of like, why are we in the system that we're in right now? How does the system function? How does it affect, our thoughts, speech, and action? Like how we really function. And I think that and you could say that the code in some way is cognitive behavioral therapy, right? It's like teaching you how to react to the stimuli being like white supremacy and racism. And so I thought that was really interesting, because it's like you really can't, I feel like you can't just like read the code and then you're like gonna be able to function. You have to have a combination of the books that we read, like kind of like the books that we read, where you're really analyzing, what are the like the ISIS papers goes through like the symbols, and like, because you could have a code, but you need to understand the symbology behind everything, because that's going to really affect how you're able to move within the society. So I thought that part was interesting about the CBT and stuff.
Well said. Totally agree. And also that therapist, you had an incorrect therapist, because even the Best of Andy Cook says that your therapist should be open to however you want to go about solving your problems. And he definitely emphasized the importance of asking your therapist questions. I thought that was a really constructive part of this book, and just asking your therapist questions, and just giving therapists an example of how to be a so-called good therapist. And he also mentioned that a therapist is supposed to make you feel safe and understood, and that is the only time that race and gender should be mentioned. I thought that was interesting, but one of the best Black psychiatrists to ever enter planet Earth was Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, and she definitely gave us a great understanding of what Black mental health looks like and how to treat Black people with their problems. And it's by the truth that the system of racism and white supremacy is here, and this is what we need to do to solve the problem. So I thought that was really interesting that white people always suggest asking questions, but when a non-white person is asking them questions, they often get annoyed or nervous or some incorrect feeling. So that's also an interesting thought as well.
Do you want to get into the MDMA part? Because I pretty much finished my notes besides that.
Oh yeah, you could definitely take charge that direction.
Okay. Yeah, I thought that section was really interesting. Because I think I have heard of MDMA, or I'm not like surprised that they've used that in psychiatry, because I know that they obviously use like acid, and there's a big push right now to legalize mushrooms, psilocybin, for psychotherapy. And so I thought that was really interesting, because I feel like MDMA is really a really popular drug in terms of being in the mainstream right now. Like I feel like every drug has its mainstream time, and from reading or from watching that documentary, Drugs as a Weapon Against Us, it made me think like, oh, that's really interesting. Like, I wonder if it's now like, you know, the MDMA time, the Molly time. And so I thought, like, when I'm listening to it, it makes sense, you know, like, oh, people are using these drugs to be able to kind of open up and talk about certain things. And it said that people were able to feel more compassion and were able to see themselves almost like outside of themselves, so they were able to kind of analyze their life and their decisions better, which I thought was interesting. But then, like, also with the stuff I've been watching and reading, it makes me, I mean, I personally don't think that anything under like a system of white supremacy is ever going to be used in a way that's just, unless it's used for white people. So like, I think it could work. I think it'll probably work in countries where there's only white people. I'm sure they do that now, but I could never see that working here. And I think because I don't know how they would really be able to regulate it or not find a way to harm Black people because of it. Like something that I noticed was, and this may be a little bit off topic, but at one point when we were talking about touch, and the lady is talking about, you know, the amount of like effort she goes into to make sure that her patients are comfortable with her touching them. So she says like, you know, don't hesitate, and other things like that, or like touch their hand first, because that's like the most comfortable place you can touch someone at the beginning. And I thought that was just, it's just so interesting to me, the amount of like care and cultivation white people give to each other, and the complete lack of care and cultivation that they give to non-white people. And, you know, like I could just think about how many people would benefit from that type of support, and that type of like really like, I want to get to know how you respond to touch, how you respond. And it just reminds me of all these people that are like manhandled by the police and things like that. And I mean, that's all to tie into the topic of drugs, in that I think that it will only really benefit white people if it even benefits them, because because when it comes to non-white people, there's no care or cultivation put into our mental health.
Really, really well said. Can't really, very little need to add anything else, but I think I'm very suspicious of all drugs being used by white people to so-called help non-white people, because I think I've seen in areas of the world where there's like less non-white people, like Portugal, they have really less strict laws on drugs, and drugs are just seen very differently over there, and the people who use them versus over here. But I think there's a pattern of behavior that I've detected, and it's certain white groups like the CIA have a pattern of introducing various drugs to non-white people, especially Black people, and these various drugs find themselves into music. And you mentioned MDMA after the book, and I have heard Molly mentioned quite recently, and music, so-called music, and that could be the next thing that white people are, no, not the next thing, but one of the many things white people are consistently pushing on non-white people to further our retardation and subjugation. Maybe incorrect though. Yeah, I think we could get into closing comments. It's been a really constructive conversation. Would you like to start?
Sure. Closing comments are, once again, like, I learned a lot from listening to this book. This is like such an extensive book. Like, it's just a lot of detail and effort was put into this book. You can just tell, because every time he's like, and we'll talk about this in chapter 17. And so there's so much more to come too. So that's just really interesting. And overall, I just really appreciated the conversation. I feel like I learned a lot and was able to it's good to read this book while understanding kind of racism, white supremacy, and put it all together. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I do appreciate this suspected racist attention to detail in this book. I have dived into this book quite a while, but this is my first time giving it such an in-depth study, and I'm learning so much. And I mentioned in the beginning the limbic system, one of the many important parts of the brain that should be understood by non-white people. So give that a Google search. And yeah, the trauma will end when justice, balance between people is produced on planet Earth. And that's my closing comments.